Welcome, everybody, to our kind of first regular global talk of 2022. We were so hoping, weren't we, that we could be back in our conference or our own seminar room for this. But alas, at least for all of this month till the end of January, we'll be doing all of our global talk meetings virtually, and then come February, we'll start to rethink new opportunities. Okay, real pleasure to be able to welcome you to today's talk by Katrina. We'll first start with the Territorial Acknowledgement, where we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. A few housekeeping notes just to start our Zoom meeting. We'll ask that you all, of course, please keep your microphone muted and your camera off until it comes to the question and answer, the discussion, and then feel free to either put your hand up and get my attention, or use the put your hand up feature in Zoom to ask a question. And of course, throughout the talk, you can feel free to use the chat feature in Zoom to share thoughts, links, etc. So we'll ask you to keep your microphone and video off until the seminar and the discussion period, and then feel free to turn either on to try to facilitate some discussion. So real pleasure to be able to introduce Katrina Ponti, who's been in our hallways, such as they are under COVID, since September, and it's been a real pleasure having Katrina here with us. Katrina is a PhD candidate in American history at the University of Rochester, in New York. Katrina, did you go back to New York, I guess, for 2 weeks? Okay, wonderful, yeah. She's here as a Fulbright Fellow, supervised by a colleague friend of mine in history, John Lutz, working here at the Center for Global Studies, completing her dissertation, and what a fascinating dissertation it is. While on Vancouver Island, she is exploring the role of the Coast Salish First Nations in guiding and shaping American diplomatic beliefs and rituals. So Katrina, I'll turn it over to you now, and thank you again for sharing this with us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Martin, for having me. You guys have been so welcoming. I've had a really great experience, even though the halls they're not totally empty, but it's been really cool. Especially thanks to Martin, Jody, John as well for having me. So for my presentation today, I want to kind of do an overview of my larger dissertation project and introduce its framework. And then I will go into the chapter and research that brought me here to Vancouver Island. As I'm looking to publish this as a book in hopefully a few years, I'd love your comments and feedback. It'd be incredibly helpful. So my project is called Agents of Exchange, and it's a history of how American citizen diplomats created strategies to help shape a global environment favorable to US interests, as well as how they created a previously unseen type of democratic diplomacy at the beginning of the long 19th century. I argue that American citizen diplomats disseminated information about the society and culture of the United States. They secured new financial and economic opportunities and created social and political networks around the world. By looking at their historical diaries and their activities of these citizen agents from our 4 countries and a dozen archives, my project tries to frame these citizen agents as necessary to national survival in a political moment of great uncertainty. To understand this role, I believe, is to understand a transitive moment in global diplomacy after the American Revolution, but before the Congress of Vienna, which routinized diplomatic practices among nations, particularly in Europe. I believe it's also to understand a shift in this relationship between a government and their citizens abroad, as well as how this redefined diplomatic service in the age of revolutions. So I work at the intersection of historiographic debates in early American history, social history, and the new diplomatic history. All of these have taken a more holistic approach to what has been a strictly political history framework for the study of diplomacy. So my research views US agents abroad as an extraterritorial social and cultural process conducted and shaped by cohorts of merchants, intellectuals, women, families, anyone who sort of traveled abroad. It's kind of a little bit of a catch-all. But they're important because Americans represented a small and insignificant nation abroad, and they wanted to be seen as distinctive from Great Britain. And they went through great lengths through trial and error to create their own rituals, languages, and relationships, both at home and abroad, that differed and differentiated them from European norms. I'm also guided by political scientist Hannah Pitkin's discussions of political representations. The United States, as the first post-colonial democracy, allowed this citizen diplomacy to develop as a form of descriptive representation. That is, though not elected, Americans abroad could represent a part of their society that otherwise would not find recognition in formal political spheres. They could embody a broader swath of American democracy, as seen with women and slaves in particular. They appear through this type of study of diplomacy abroad. In turn, these operatives abroad could influence American foreign policy back home. So my project is essentially a series of 5 intertwined case studies that reveal 2 types of citizen diplomat. I call them compulsory diplomats and assistive diplomats. I'm not crazy about these names, so if anyone has any interesting snazzy titles for them, I'd be happy to hear them. But right now they're placeholders for what are largely two designations that describe both the venue and the agent of diplomatic labor. So the first for assistive diplomats, these were the families and households of formal missions, American missions to Europe. So think the family of John Adams, the family, the daughters of Thomas Jefferson. I really hone in on them. From the perspective of wives, children, and servants, we can see the function of the American diplomatic household as what is modernly called representation in foreign service circles. It's a modern term that describes a historical tradition of quasi-professional and symbolic roles played by the families attached to these missions. Their presence abroad was a national duty meant to project the authority of the United States in international negotiations, as well as the viability of its economy, society, culture, and most importantly, its future as a viable nation. The main way that these families conveyed this image was providing them with a picture of American life abroad, its virtues of a healthy, well-educated, and vigorous family that is thriving within, though foreign, a well-appointed American-style household. But for the rest of the presentation, I want to focus on my second group of individuals, the compulsory diplomats. These were American participants, mostly overwhelmingly male. They were members of maritime labor. So merchant supercargoes, sailor surgeons, captains, and the common sailor, who in the course of their regular jobs already access really broad geographies, often out of the reach of traditional American missions abroad. So after the American Revolution, it was initially this type of commerce that really drove a vast majority of Americans out into the world. However, Americans were locked out of British Atlantic possessions, and merchants had to kind of extend their remaining networks beyond the Atlantic Ocean into the Indo-Pacific region. So in this process, American maritime actors established themselves as viable strategic tools, as culture and commercial diplomats in this kind of multicultural maritime landscape. Immediately after the revolution, they initiated several maritime ventures into the Indo-Pacific. Among them was the first trip to Canton on the Empress of China, which is my first chapter, as well as to Vancouver Island, which I'll talk about in a bit. But essentially, this initial mission was to greet the world and to state their independence, not only from Great Britain, but also from economic reliance on European powers in the Atlantic world. Though this formulation by Americans, commercial Americans, was earnestly done. The first 20 years of their ventures into the Pacific yielded really only modest financial returns. So much of these efforts were symbolically done. But one merchant even kind of quoted from Aesop's fables that the mountains are in labor and a ridiculous mouse will be born. So the Great American Revolution that rocked the great British Empire and shook the foundation of Western nations and created this democracy. But what emerged kind of from this great earthquake was not a cohesive and powerful nation, but kind of this strange little Republican mouse that lived on the edge of world affairs. So all of these efforts of Americans abroad is to kind of, though small, though weird, though, Republican, they really had a blank slate to kind of formulate what the world thought about an American or Americans as a whole. But with a healthy sense of irony and hope, these merchants set out to make their presence known in the world. And so this now brings me to how Americans made themselves known in the Pacific Northwest, particularly here on Vancouver Island. So in the 1790s, Vancouver Island was a diplomatic battleground between Europeans, Americans, and First Nations. As the British challenged Spanish colonial claims, American trade vessels sought economic relations with native tribes for sea otter furs to sell in Canton to their newly made connections in China. As each of these groups interacted with each other, they created their own languages of war and peace. And what emerges from these interactions is a story that brings forward perspectives of First Nations people in strategically guiding cross-cultural relations and facilitating their own security against what must have been, must have seemed like a European onslaught. But for Americans in all of this, their experiences constituted a primer on the contrasting processes of diplomatic ritual on the edge of their oceanic world. Through the lens of American commercial expansion to the Pacific, this maritime space established for Americans an understanding of tension among British, Spanish, as well as already deeply entrenched interests of First Nations tribal leaders. And they all vied for precedence among their peers in controlling this region. These multiple contact points and rival interests incorporated Vancouver Island and its people that it brought into contact. They all brought together multiple empires, both ideological, landed, commercial, and it placed Americans in this kind of unique place to observe the different facets of how each group represented and ritualized their influence in the area. Americans ultimately sifted through these geographies of inclusion and exclusion, relying on their own instincts and language of commerce to remain aloof from conflict with the Europeans, but also extracting small concessions from each party for its own enterprise and even just a slight influence in global affairs. So the American part of the story begins in 1787 when a joint cohort of Boston and New York merchants equipped the vessel, the Columbia Rediviva, and its consort vessel, the Lady Washington. These vessels became the first in a 20-year wave of American merchant vessels that came to ply the Pacific Northwest for sea otter furs to sell in China. They became witness to and participants in a stripped back form of diplomacy that relied on personal relationships rather than the backing of national prestige to survive the political goals of multiple competing parties. So I'll return to our American vessels shortly, but first I kind of want to discuss the world of Vancouver Island at pre-contact. I have a map, hopefully, that should help illustrate this a little bit. So as you can see, this is Vancouver Island, and it shows roughly what I'm going to talk about. Okay. So the waters and coves of the Northwest Coast were transitional and transnative spaces that were held in trust and controlled by a network of indigenous chieftains, incorporating and seeking to incorporate new visitors into their ancient worldviews. This process of incorporation and American-European encounters with these First Nations in this period was considered or constituted this idea of misconnections of exchange that each challenged pre-existing understandings of contact and expansion into the Pacific. So as you can see in the map, the three main regions of contact on the Northwest coast were controlled by networks of the Mowchat and Clicket peoples along the western coast of Vancouver Island, and then the Macau of the Olympic Peninsula, which is now Washington State. All three are part of the Wakashan linguistic family, all sharing a series of related Nukin style dialects. On the eve of contact, each group maintained diplomatic and trade connections amongst each other and further inland, which long predated European contact. The respective leaders of each of these groups, Mequinna, Wickaninnish, and Tatoosh, all represented the first generation of encounter with American Europeans, and they ruled chains of villages along the western coast of Vancouver Island and Washington. They held considerable consolidated political power that extended well beyond their tribal lands. And they based this influence on performative rituals of generosity centered around their marine environment. So intimate knowledge of the bioregion in this Northwest coast essentially formed the cultural and spiritual foundation of the coast Salish existence. So villages on the coast existed to exploit regular currents and seasonal shifts in the seascape. The natural wealth of provisions allowed seasonal villages to thrive. And then temporary summer villages allowed tribes to fish, while more permanent winter villages provided shelter from the winter storms. Social relations followed a three-tiered system, each acknowledging the shifting nature of kinship and shifts in wealth. At the top were chiefs and their families, followed by commoners and then slaves. Leaders claimed supernatural ancestral ties and owned tangible property rights like fertile bays and inlets, as well as intangible possessions like family titles, songs, stories, and names. These passed through kinship networks, and members of both genders could hold positions of authority. In controlling maritime and cultural wealth, leaders could leverage power by gifting hunting and fishing rights to commoners who then respected their authority. In turn, chiefs received a portion of harvested goods from the maritime landscape. The Northwest coast also served as a hub of the local slave trade. High status items, slaves formed up to about 30% of the population in a village and could be used as gifts. So the Salish culture of gift giving was the mechanism by which our three chiefs, Mequinna, Wickaninnish, and Tatoosh, maintained authority and political cohesion through influence rather than coercion, though coercion did exist quite a bit. But I would kind of want to look at their more diplomatic activities. The most profound, I believe, exhibition of influence centered around the ability to provide for one's people. And the ultimate symbol of this ability, as well as one's strength and surplus wealth, was the whale. Much like Hobbes' Leviathan, the whale embodied the ideal polity. Only chiefs could lead whale hunts, and even then, only after extensive rituals that called upon the spirit realm to ask for aid and to affirm their right to the kill. Drift whales, those dead leviathans that washed up on tribal shores, also belonged to the chief, which he could then allocate to his people through massive feasts of whale meat and the distribution of blubber and bones for oil rendering. This essentially formed the foundation of the potlatch system practiced by the Coast Salish. Potlatch, both the event and the action, is the bringing together of a community to share food, dance, receive gifts from their leaders, and to establish a community cohesion. There are multiple subcategories of potlatch outside of the whale hunt, which can include weddings, memorials, rites of passage, and adoption. At each of these feasts, a chief could endow new social stations through the public giving of a high status gift, particularly an otter pelt. But these formalized rituals established a literal and symbolic social obligation between a chief and his people for survival in this rugged landscape. The lavish display and distribution of wealth would also increase a chief's influence over a larger number of people and bringing him into direct competition with other leaders. Ultimately, Anglo-European visitors who now began to arrive into this maritime borderland were subject to these the hierarchical expectations of these tribes. Essentially, the European vessels were brought into the coast Salish worldview as essentially drift whales. They were property owned by the chief, and contact with the vessel's occupants could be shared at the chief's pleasure with his people. So the chief could sell furs or dictating who could sell when and for how much. So this sort of interaction and trade was gifted, and at least initially disrupted imperial processes that Europeans tried to impose on the area. And to kind of go into a few examples of how each chief kind of, used this drift whale idea to exert influence over the Europeans. Captain Cook, the first British visitor to Vancouver Island, noted that Mequinna, quote, wished to secure all of the advantage of our commerce for themselves. They claimed the exclusive privilege of buying or selling anything. And even so, he still Mequinna wished Nuka to be a secure place for foreign visitors, to be safe political and economic space. It was even Nuka Sound eventually became known as Friendly Cove by the Europeans. Additionally, Mequinna requested firearms and asked the Europeans, quote, not to sell to any other tribe any musket or firearm, whatever, lest they put themselves on a footing for defense against the natives of Nuka Sound. So that was Mequinna's strategy to kind of incorporate Europeans into the worldview. Alternately, Wickaninnish, a bit further south in the Clicket Sound, he already, unlike Mequinna, had more ready access to sea otter furs to trade and had the ability to dismiss or accept European trade at will. Americans who took upon themselves to learn the basics of the Nuchalnuth language found it a bit easier to trade with Wickaninish's people, an accomplishment that apparently neither the Spanish or British accomplished. And finally, Tatoosh was much less interested in trade, and more interested in showing strength, which I'll talk about a bit later. So each three kind of found different ways to incorporate these newcomers into their world. So it was this borderland space that our Americans and Europeans entered, and were largely unprepared to navigate the native-led political landscape. So the Europeans were, and their imperial ideas that they brought to Vancouver Island. Yes, they were all united by a drive to buy furs, but they also wanted to control physical plots of Vancouver Island. Essentially, there are four visions of the imperial process that tried to prevail in this small space. The Spanish saw the Pacific Northwest as the natural extension of their already relatively ancient empire in the New World. And from the naval hub in St. Blas, Mexico, it was just a very easy trip just up north. As the Spanish started probing north, they encountered scattered Russians around the Aleutian Islands. The Russian-American Company, which was created on orders of Catherine the Great, they settled first in the Aleutian Islands, intermarrying with the First Nation tribes there, and hunting for their own otter furs, but largely remained around their hub at Unalaska, much further north. The British arrived, as I mentioned, with the voyage of Captain Cook. They were seeking the Northwest Passage, and also to seek exploitable resources. The Americans, as we will see on the Columbia and Lady Washington ships, they used Cook's geography and maps to arrive in 1788. But again, their imperial vision was clearly economic for independent enterprise. But it was by 1789 that at least 3 of these Spanish, British, and American all-comers started to come into contact and cause conflict. And it was the Spanish who ultimately decided to solidify its influence in the area and enforce its claim on the region to all European or American arrivals. The Spanish essentially believed themselves to have initiated imperial control through their traditional way of, essentially established by Christopher Columbus, was you plant a cross, claim the land in the name of God for your king and country, and then you have mass, and now you own the land. But they also asked for a plot of land from Maquina, who readily accepted the gift in exchange for some arms. But Maquina also, again, another example of him kind of controlling these relationships, he also allowed the Englishman John Mears to build a small fort in exchange for some dueling pistols. The Americans also were allowed to have temporary use on the Nuka Sound. So in all cases, again, this imperial process is being disrupted. So since there was, even though all of these Europeans and Americans were trying to plant themselves in some way on Vancouver Island, there was really no permanent settlement. Essentially, these little landed hubs served as places to maybe spend the winter, to repair ships. But most of the time, American, British ships are coasting along the whole Pacific Northwest, trading with various different tribes. And only so they're each periodically making touch points with each other and other tribes. So all of these claims were exercised very periodically. But the issue did come to a head in 1789 when the American crews of the Columbia and Lady Washington witnessed the commander of the Spanish garrison, his name was Martinez. They essentially decided to start seizing British vessels that began to arrive in the Nuka Sound. And essentially they enlisted the Americans in confirming this right to take these British vessels. So Americans drawn into this dispute kind of calculated their own role in favor of the Spanish and kind of made these really split-second decisions that ultimately saved their own skins. So essentially, the Americans first met with John Mears, the British captain of several British ships, and Robert Haswell, one of the second mate of the Columbia, noted their first reaction to John Mears, which was lukewarm at best. So Mears was the supercargo for 3 British-owned and British-manned ships. But each of these ships were commanded by Portuguese captains, flying the Portuguese flag and carrying the Portuguese endorsement of Macau, so that they could trade in the Northwest Coast. This was called, by many, they were called renegado Englishmen who were using fake papers to circumvent the British East India Company. So the Americans arrived as Mears was settling his own plot of land on Nootka Sound. And they even watched as he launched the first Western style sloop to be launched in the Northwest Coast, and it was called the Northwest America. So unlike the Spanish claiming ceremonies, this was a very British way of claiming space. They refined the natural resources on Nootka Sound and turned it into a tool of trade. But throughout these periodic encounters between the British and Americans, they often ate dinner together. But the British essentially decided to, quote, fully employ themselves fabricating and rehearsing vague and improbable tales relative to the cost of the coast and the vast danger attending to its navigation. The British, trying to scare the Americans off, took the tales even further and said that they had, quote, not collected 50 skins. The Americans, very upset by this notorious falsity, had essentially initiated this kind of downturn in their relationship with the British, particularly John Mears. But John Mears, in turn, thought very little of the Americans. He called Captain Kendrick of the Lady Washington, he called him haughty, and suggested that Kendrick lied, that he was an American. John Mears is sort of historically known as a bit of a fabricator, a mix of fabricator at worst and grand storyteller at best. So his stories are a bit weird. But for the Americans, this encounter with John Mears put a sour taste in their mouth because his ungentlemanlike behavior went against this idea of personal honor. So especially when you're in a far off coast from your home, ultimately the framework of genteel behavior and ethics was reduced to its most fundamental. The idea of honesty and keeping your promise among individuals, whether between British and American, American and First Nations, right? Americans held this kind of deep idea of honor. And it was also necessary for Americans to survive in unfamiliar landscapes when these larger rules of engagement remain clouded. So when interacting with Mears, it was a good common ground to start a relationship, honesty. But essentially it was a type of honesty that the Mears clearly flouted. So after their interactions with the British, the Americans spent the winter of 1788-89 in Nootka Sound. And in May, they finally met the Spanish, the Princesa, which Captain Martinez led. And what Martinez found in Nootka Sound, in addition to the Americans, was John Mears' false flagged, fake Portuguese vessels. And essentially, Martinez just started taking the British vessels. And the Americans also witnessed this situation and feared their own detention. So the Americans sent a letter to Martinez explaining the American presence in the Spanish space, and tried to endear himself to Martinez by sending his own son to act as the fifth mate on one of Martinez's Spanish ships. A situation that Martinez supported, and John Kendrick's son stayed in the Spanish army for ultimately the rest of his life. In exchange as well, Martinez offered to carry American letters back home. And in these letters, the Americans wrote to their bosses and to the US Congress that they were in good friendship with the Spanish, and that the Spanish, they thought, had the best right to owning Nootka Sound, and that the three vessels in the Sound were clearly in the wrong. So as you can see, Americans are kind of trying to play these relationships with the Spanish and the British. But essentially this formed the beginning of what would be known as the Nootka Sound controversy. And as tensions rose in Nootka Sound, the Americans essentially had to make a choice over who they were going to side with. And Americans ultimately chose the Spanish. They called them the European lords of the soil, and they claimed their rights as a neutral party as well as their ability to have learned the Nootka languages to help support the Spanish claims on the coast. But throughout the Spanish interactions with the British, Kendrick even a little bit tried to play with Mears as well. He even claimed to Mears, like, I am neutral, I will come and say, like, I will help you, I will take your I will take your men back to Canton, to the British, to be safe. And again, Mears kind of, again, touting this idea of manly, gentlemanly honor, made the situation worse and essentially spat in Kendrick's face. And so this was the sort of the situation that kind of prevailed among the Americans. I guess I'll end there. There's a lot more, obviously there's a lot more nuance to this, but this was essentially the lay of the land and how the spread of interactions and rituals kind of worked. And essentially, despite their many differences, First Nations, Americans, and Europeans were all in one way or another united as saltwater people. They nurtured worldviews oriented around a maritime environment and saw their landscapes from the decks of a ship. Their relationships to these landscapes and their inhabitants, both human and animal, created self-serving diplomatic languages that did not necessarily intend permanent friendship, but mutual exploitation and to aid in the consolidation of separate ethnic power identities. Americans, amid all of this, achieved these aims by being some of the first merchants to identify a new exploitable resource and to get in on the ground floor of otter for investment. They were, at least initially, savvy enough to recognize the power structures that prevailed on Vancouver Island and cautiously appeased everyone, but siding with the Spanish when pressed to decide. I'm happy to take questions, more clarity. I know that was sort of a very rough and dirty version of what was going on, but I'm happy to talk and answer questions. Martin.
Thank you, Katrina. That's fascinating. So we'll open it up for discussion and questions. You can either use the hand feature in Zoom, or just turn your video on, and hopefully will be able to you'll be able to track my attention that way. If there are questions in chat, I'll ask Jody and Kayla to keep an eye on that. Help me keep an eye on that as well.
Sounds good.
Maybe I'll start, Katrina. Have you had a chance to, I mean, I know COVID and everything else, but have you had a chance to visit those areas in detail, please?
Not yet. I'm planning on that right now
And
for,
how would you organize that? And what would you seek to get out of it?
yes. How, well, I
Like, where would you go? And yeah.
John, yeah. Well, I'm planning on heading to Tofino hopefully soon. That's essentially the modern Clicket sound. And I guess the Friendly Cove Nuka Sound adventure will hopefully be in April when the weather's a little better. I think a lot, as I sort of mentioned, this idea of being like the idea of saltwater people, the idea of this landscape, the idea of encountering this world by water. And that's really what I want to get out of this. It's the experiential aspects, when archives are tricky to get to. But I want to understand the landscape that these people were living in and encountering, and how the land hit them. Also, hopefully in Gold River, I will meet a few people that I can talk to. I'm weirdly good at talking to strangers. And so right, like, I guess it's also this kind of interesting connection of past and present, like how a landscape like Nuka Sound, so sparsely populated now, was such a thriving place at another point. So I think for me, it's more of an experiential research trip rather than maybe a traditional historical archival one, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And that notion of landscapes from the decks of the ship, I think, is a very powerful one, especially for comparatively in terms of colonial history. But yes. Thank you. John, you have your hand up, and then I'll ask Amy.
Sure, thanks. Well, I do have a question a couple of questions for Katrina, but also a suggestion for the Center for Global Studies. So I organized a conference many years ago and we organized a trip up to Friendly Cove and went out, got a water taxi out from Gold River to the site of this first encounter between Europeans and Indigenous people. And so there is a suggestion there for the center to organize a tour out to Friendly Cove at this place of global resolution. So
John, this wouldn't be our first, because we've also connected on the colonial legacies bus tour of Victoria. So I think we have lots to build on there.
All right, so we can plant that seed. But for Katrina, thanks for that. I read this.
Yeah, you read this
chapter earlier, but I hadn't heard kind of the main framing of it all, and so I'm really excited to see this kind of notion of how this mouse of a nation and this kind of historical moment where I think many of us just think of the U.S. as always been a power, almost from its birth. But of course, you're pointing out that that's not true, and in these early days, they were struggling to define themselves and to figure out what a country would look like and what their foreign relationships would look like. So my question, though, is, I guess maybe I have two questions. One is maybe you could say a little bit more about why the Spanish didn't impound the Americans when they found them there in the way that they impounded the British and kind of set off that conflict. And you noticed that you commented on how the Americans aligned themselves with the Spanish in this kind of moment of international crisis. Is there any time in the history that you're looking at where one European nation allies itself with the indigenous people, as them as their kind of main ally in the Pacific Northwest, rather than other Europeans? So there's two questions.
Okay. Let's see. So more about why the Spanish didn't impound the Americans. It seemed to be that the British tried to do this with the Spanish too, where they tried to prevail upon Martinez that, oh no, we're just in Friendly Cove because it's friendly and we're trying to repair our ships. We were buffeted by the winds and we're just trying to find safe harbor to repair. I know Mears tried to do that, and I think him and or one of his other captains tried to do that one too many times, and Martinez got very upset because you can clearly see from the vantage point, at least how I understand the geography, was the vantage point that the Spanish holding was on. They could clearly see the British trying to trade with First Nations, and Mears was clearly lying. So I think that kind of, I really think it goes back to this idea of gentlemanly honor, right? This idea of honesty amongst individuals, the handshake and the pat on the back and having dinner together, right? And Mears readily abused that. Whereas the Americans, right, kind of understood that, at least from my perspective on the American side of things, was they came in clearly in distress. They clearly needed to be in Nuka. Obviously they wanted to trade, but they were clearly there and wanted to repair, and found ways to trade. They happily had dinner together, right? They went through the gentlemanly rituals of being together and asking for support, trading information in goodwill and good faith. So I think that's what it came down to, is like breaking faith or keeping faith.
So, just to interrupt for a second, I think, so your argument there is basically it's the interpersonal skills and their if you like, informal diplomatic skills that save the Americans from being impounded and having their ships and crews sent to San Blas, as happened to the British. I'll make one alternative suggestion, maybe, which and this is just a question. You know, there were not that many Spanish in Friendly Cove, 2 ships, and I don't know, I'll make up a number of 30 or 40 men. Maybe numerically, they didn't think they could take on the British and the Americans at the same time, and the British with a greater threat. So if they could ally themselves with the Americans, or at least not have them, you know, ally with the British, then there's the physical challenge of rounding up these crews and putting them on ships and sending them south that maybe they didn't have the capacity. So anyway, I leave that as a
No, I like that. Yeah, no, since I was so focused on the Americans, but that's a good point to kind of rally your strategy together against the British. I like that. And as far as European alignment with other First Nations, that I would have to probably defer to you on that one. I'm not 100% certain, at least through my study of the American side of things with the diaries. Well, that's a lie. Actually, the Spanish did have quite good relations in Nuku Sound with Mequinna. They, I think Spanish and First Nations worldviews, I kind of weirdly complemented each other in a very interesting way. They kind of, at least I know in the American South, historians have called this the idea of shared diplomacies, where this spiritual grounding for why they believe they have ownership or stewardship over a landscape is very similar, both endowed by a spiritual being, the idea of giving of oneself, of giving one's gifts, of sharing a meal, both resonated very, very intensely, I think, for both groups of people. And Martinez really loved hanging out with Mequinna. He loved the potlatch. He understood this idea of exchange, of singing together, of dancing together. He even tried, at the conclusion of the Nuku Sound controversy, the Spanish ultimately had to cede control of Nuku Sound to the portions to the British. He tried to tell the British how important it was that they do similar ritual exchanges with Mequinna and other tribes in the region to establish goodwill. And Vancouver and the British sort of poo-pooed that and said, no, it's not how we do things, and kind of disrupted this kind of interesting spiritual and friendship balance established between the two. But I don't know, John, if you have other examples maybe? Or
I know that people want to ask questions. So
sorry.
I'll be short just to say that I think the European, although the Spanish did, as you say, form really warm relationships with the Nuu-chah-nulth and more so than the Americans. So that probably is a good example. but there's a couple incidents where First Nations are attacking one European vessel, and the other vessel came to their aid, protecting the Europeans rather than siding with the Indigenous people, even the Europeans were probably the aggressors. So I'll let others jump in with a question.
Thank you, John. Let's turn to Amy first, and then I'll ask Greg. Thanks, Amy.
Thanks, Katrina. That was a really intimate portrayal of these encounters, so I really appreciated you sharing that. Two questions. The first is, I'm curious how this chapter fits in with kind of the bigger context of the dissertation and that shift of the ridiculous mouse to sort of a more established, hegemonic force. And if there are sort of pieces from this chapter that contribute to that or challenge that argument. And then the second question is about the archives. I'd love to hear a bit more about your process there, and to what extent you're able to find archival material around the Coast Salish nations and their perceptions of these encounters, and to what extent their presence or absence limits your analysis or not. Thanks.
That's good. Absence. So for your first question, this idea of from mouse to hegemon is one I'm still playing with in the last chapter that I'm writing. I think elements of this chapter is the idea of the geography, this idea that Americans are, after these 20 years, they are essentially, I don't want to say dominating the Pacific world, but probably 8 out of 10 vessels plying the trade routes from around South America and heading towards the Pacific coast are American and or British. So as a result, this leads to much more American engagement in South America. So it's just sort of the geographic consequences of this frequent trade with the Pacific Northwest that sort of starts to lead into much more frequent contact of Americans with the revolutionary movements of the early 19th century in Chile, in Peru, in Brazil. And part of the success of American influence on these revolutions is because the Chileans have outside of the Spanish, they have more contact with American merchants than any other foreigner. So they are kind of exposed to these, imperfect ideas of democracy and republicanism and what that means. And you start, at least in my last chapter, I'm sort of starting to piece this together, this idea that it was these merchants that sort of started this process who were frequently traveling to the Pacific, trading. It started with this kind of goodwill with the Spanish, but then continued into the Age of Revolutions, where they're really starting to influence these revolutions. And then you sort of start to see these seeds of the Monroe Doctrine start to be planted, whether intentionally or unintentionally, through these merchant trade routes, started by these first American vessels. So I wouldn't say it's from mouse to hegemon, but I think it's this very slow, steady ideological spread. My archival process has been a pain in the butt. Now, I love archival work, but it's kind of arduous when it's thank God for the modern world, because archival lists are now published online, so you can start to flip through things. But I've always been fascinated with travel diaries, and rather than viewing them as these anecdotal touristy activities, I've started to see them as these political documents in a lot of ways. They're what they're doing and how they're talking, and it really started to get me to reflect on how they're interacting with the greater world and why, and how they're, rather than them like complaining about like, well, I'm American, we don't do things this way, the Europeans are so backwards, viewing that as a political statement. Why do they think that way? Why are they doing it? And how is that affecting their relationships with others? And I've definitely encountered being such a hard archival historian. Coming to Vancouver Island has really challenged my traditional historian's brain to get at the First Nations perspectives. Part of my project here was to do oral histories, but with First Nations leaders and communities to kind of maybe get at this history and even this tradition of human interaction, right? The basic fundamentals of what it means to be human doesn't necessarily change over 300 years, 200 years. So perhaps these traditional rituals, these traditional stories that kind of carry through, at least what I was theorizing would speak to the story that I'm trying to tell. Unfortunately, that hasn't totally happened. Hopefully I'll get to do a little bit of that in April, but in the meantime, I've sort of called back on my historical archaeology training and this idea of the cultural object. So I've been doing a bit of work in the museum, the BC Museum, and looking at objects. One of my favorite ones, it's in the cafe in the museum. It's the Coast Salish welcome statue. And when I saw it, I was like, oh, this is the first thing an American would have seen sailing into a tribal cove. And I'm like, and right for me too, I was like, I am welcome. So it's kind of looking at a cultural object, thinking about the emotions that evokes, why that would be there, and sort of working backwards that way into trying to get these Indigenous perspectives. I'm still kind of an apprentice in that activity, but that's also part of why I'm here, is to kind of work through it. Perspectives, presence, or absence. I hope that sort of answers the question, but.
Yeah, thanks, Katrina.
Yeah.
Thank you, Katrina. Thank you, Amy. Greg, can I ask you to turn your microphone on?
Yes. Thanks very much, Katrina. This is a fascinating project, and the aspects you were just talking about, I think, really enrich in it. I want to take you back to more traditional historiography on the diplomatic side, and the context is this very complex nexus of international relations between China and the West, that it, was the result of several centuries of evolution. And I'm wondering, I've got several related questions, but the basic one is there any possibility that the British ships actually did have Macau Portuguese registration? Because later on in the following decades, the British played on registration with ships in the Canton trade a lot, right? So, and this is the era when there was a strong British-Portuguese alliance internationally, right, against Spain, among other things. So that's the basic question. Coming off of that, though, I also wonder if there was not a fake registration, but a real Macau registration for the British ships, would the Spanish have honored the Portuguese or the ship's presence in the Pacific Northwest? Because under the Treaty of Tordesillas, that was Spanish territory, not Portuguese.
Yeah.
Any idea?
Yes, I think it was real. The issue was John Mears. He was. I think because the Spanish were outnumbered, outmanned, they were willing to go with the fiction, right? Like, we don't have the energy to capture you right now. But because Mears is planting a British flag right in front of them and saying this is, and he brought I think he brought 29 or 30 Chinese carpenters to come build British ships with Britain. So, right, Mears kind of messed up the fiction, right? I think everyone was willing to go with it until Mears started playing the flag. And I think the Spanish did. They kind of, for a few months, Martinez went back and forth like, oh, I'll capture this one ship and then let it go with the stern talking to, but then the same vessel came back again, right? Like, yeah, the British were kind of abusing that kind of willful ignorance. So that's my suspicion.
Right. Thanks very much.
Oh, is there?
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Katrina. Anybody else? We may be coming to wrap things up, but beforehand, I can't. I think we really need to pursue this idea of looking at Nootka Sound as a local space, an indigenous space, but one in which these larger global processes, trade, diplomacy, etc., are represented here, right? And I mean, this is so close to what the center, how the center is pitching much of its activities, you know, and the relationship between the local and the global.